The Second World War was full of misunderstandings. The simplistic portrayal of it as a titanic struggle ending in the victory of democracy over dictatorship never bears examination.
앤터니 비버보다 2차 세계대전을 잘 아는 역사학자는 없을 겁니다. 도합 5,000페이지에 이르는 이 9권의 책에 앤터니 비버가 탐구한 2차 대전의 진실이 담겨 있죠. 전 세계의 전운이 감도는 지금, 히틀러라는 이름에 가려진 2차 세계대전의 불편한 진실을 마주할 시간입니다. 전 세계에 흩어져 있는 위대한 생각들을 모았습니다. 어떤 생각은 우리를 저 먼 곳으로 데려갑니다.
Welcome to EBS, Wiederhören Suap, Great Minds. My name is Antony Beevor, and I'm a historian of war and a writer. Attempts to make comparison with the Second World War should also be resisted because of the bewildering variety of the conflicts and theatres of war. In Europe, our knowledge of war in East Asia and the Pacific region is still very limited, both of the military events and of civilian suffering. We think of the appalling treatment of Western prisoners of war by the Japanese in the Far East. Yet we forget that local populations endured far worse treatment. On the so-called Burma Railway, a third of Allied prisoners died, but well over half the local forced labourers perished. In the Far East, before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Malaya, the appalling complacency and racial arrogance of colonial society had produced a dangerous self-deception among the British. Their fatal underestimation of the Imperial Japanese Army included the idea that all Japanese soldiers were very short-sighted and inherently inferior to Western troops. In fact, they were immeasurably tougher, far more mobile and astonishingly self-sufficient. They did not need bridging equipment. Their soldiers cut thick bamboos, then threw themselves in pairs into a river and bent forward with the bamboos running from shoulder to shoulder in parallel to form a bridge for their comrades to run over. Japanese soldiers had been brought up in a militaristic society. Their mothers would lovingly prepare a 1,000-stitch scarf for them to wear, supposedly to ward off bullets. The whole village or neighborhood, paying homage to these martial values, would usually turn out to bid farewell to conscripts departing to join the army. Soldiers dreaded disgracing their family and community. And this, according to a number of Japanese historians, was far more powerful than ideas of glory in dying for the emperor. The basic training was designed to destroy individuality. Recruits were constantly insulted, slapped and beaten by their sergeants and corporals to toughen them up. In what might be called the knock-on theory of oppression, this treatment was also intended to provoke them to take their anger out in turn on the soldiers and civilians of a defeated enemy. During the so-called Rape of Nanking in December 1937, Japanese officers made Chinese prisoners kneel in rows, then practiced beheading them one by one with their samurai swords. Their soldiers were also ordered to carry out bayonet practice on thousands of Chinese prisoners bound up or tied to trees. Any soldiers who refused were beaten severely by their NCOs. The Imperial Japanese Army's process of dehumanizing its troops was stepped up as soon as they arrived in China from the home islands. A Corporal Nakamura, who had himself been conscripted as a soldier against his will, described in his diary how they made some new recruits watch as they tortured 5 Chinese civilians to death. The newcomers were horrified, but Nakamura wrote, "All new recruits are like this, but soon they will be doing the same things themselves." Their commanders, imbued with their own sense of racial superiority and convinced of Japan's right to rule over East Asia, remained impervious to the fundamental contradiction that their war was supposed to free the region from Western tyranny. The Japanese Army's treatment of conquered populations and defeated enemies dazed Westerners who had never imagined such cruelty in modern times. Japanese officers talked of samurai honor, which called for the generous treatment of the defeated, yet they never practiced it. They claimed that they were liberating Asia from Western colonialism, yet imposed a far worse oppression themselves, which led to famine and economic collapse in every country they occupied. John Haber, the German businessman from Siemens, who courageously organized a safety zone in Nanking, wrote in his diary, "I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese. On the one hand, they want to be recognized and treated as a great power on a level with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality, and bestiality that bears no comparison except with the hordes of Genghis Khan." Japan in the 1930s had become a dangerous combination of ancient culture and parvenu power. Towards the end of the war, Japanese officers did not merely condone, but actively encouraged cannibalism. These were not isolated cases. A similar pattern was found across the army in China and Pacific garrisons which were being cut off from supplies by the US Navy. It became clear from all the reports collected later by the American military authorities and the Australian War Crimes Section that the, I quote, "widespread practice of cannibalism by Japanese soldiers in the Asia-Pacific War was something more than merely random incidents perpetrated by individuals or small groups subject to extreme conditions. The testimonies indicate that cannibalism was a systematic and organized military strategy." Both locals and Allied prisoners of war, especially those who remained loyal from the British Indian Army, were kept alive as human cattle and then butchered for their meat, one by one. Allied authorities, understandably afraid of the horror this would cause to the families of all of those who had died in prison camps, decided to suppress the facts entirely. As a result, cannibalism never featured at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946. On the 9th of May 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the rifle companies of the 1st United States Marine Division on Okinawa, their reaction was, so what? They were exhausted and filthy, and everything around them stank. As far as they were concerned, the war in Europe was indeed another war on another planet. After the savage fighting on Okinawa, there remained the even more dreadful prospect of having to invade the Japanese home islands of Honshu and Hokkaido, where soldiers and civilians alike were preparing to fight to the death. None of the Marines then knew of the atomic bombs prepared in such secrecy. The more intelligent Japanese commanders, such as Lieutenant General Kuriyabayashi on Iwo Jima and General Ushijima on Okinawa made no attempt to oppose American amphibious landings and forbade their men to waste their lives in any banzai charges. They fought from networks of tunnels and caves, enhanced with concrete with sliding iron doors, and even extractor fans to remove the cordite smoke. With well-protected field guns and interlocking fields of fire from machine gun posts, they were formidable defensive positions. By the 25th of March 1945, when the battle for Iwo Jima ended, 6,821 Marines had been killed or mortally wounded, as well as another 19,217 severely wounded. Apart from 54 Japanese wounded taken prisoner, Kuribashi's force of 21,000 men were all dead. On Okinawa, even some of the toughest Marines suffered from nervous collapse, mainly due to the accuracy of Japanese mortar and artillery fire. Everyone suffered from thudding headaches from the noise of the guns and explosions. At night, the Japanese would try to infiltrate their lines, so star shells or flares were fired continuously into the sky, lighting up the nightmare terrain with a dead greenish glow. But even Japanese soldiers were liable to suffer combat fatigue. They referred to paralyzing fear as losing your legs, or uncontrollable trembling as the samurai shakes. It's now been established that the Japanese military, in Operation Ketsugo, were prepared to sacrifice not only their own men, but also all civilians, forcing them to defend the home islands with suicide tactics. So another of the grim paradoxes of the Second World War is that the terrible atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are now estimated to have saved anything between 2 and 8 million Japanese lives, far more than the number that they killed. On the 26th of July 1945, the Western Allies issued the Potsdam Ultimatum, demanding Japan's surrender. This was rejected 3 days later, and American intercepts of Japanese military communications revealed that the commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army had no intention of giving up. On the 6th of August, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The war party in Tokyo, including the minister, General Anami, and all the most senior generals and admirals insisted that the fight must continue. Their plan of Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive, would make the Allies invade the home islands, where Japanese commanders planned to force 28 million civilian militia to counterattack, armed with bamboo spears and explosive charges strapped to their chests like suicide bombers. Japanese generals and admirals had convinced themselves that Allied morale was brittle and they would give up on suffering heavy casualties. Admiral Onishi argued, "If we are prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives in a special attack effort, victory will be ours." The civilian politicians who wanted peace had no control over the army and navy. On the 9th of August, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan with massive attacks in northern China, Mongolia, and Manchuria. That night, an imperial conference was called at the palace. Some historians have tried to argue that the Red Army's actions would have been enough to provoke the Japanese into surrender. But this was simply not true, as their most senior commanders made clear. General Umezu, the chief of the General Staff, stated, "While Soviet entry was unfavorable, it did not affect the plan to fight in the homeland. And it would be unthinkable to now accept unconditional surrender after so many had given their lives for His Majesty." But Emperor Hirohito clearly indicated that the greatly increased effectiveness of the atomic bombs left them no choice but to end the war. The generals and admirals, encouraged by middle-ranking officers, still wanted to fight on, despite the emperor's decision. He had to record his broadcast in secret, hide the recordings, and conceal himself in the royal palace as middle-ranking and junior officers tried to arrest him and launch a coup. Finally, on the 15th of August, 4 days before the Americans planned to drop a third atomic bomb, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast brought the war to an end.
世界の体制また我に出あらず、しかのみならず敵は新たに残虐なる爆弾を使用してしけれに向こうを殺傷し、残骸の及ぶところ真にかかるべからざるに至る。
The British commander-in-chief in Burma, General William Slim, observed that while Japanese commanders were brave men, they were moral cowards. They knew the war was lost. Yet for the sake of their own honor, they were prepared to make millions of their own civilians die. It was not just their own civilians who would die in their millions if the war was prolonged into the following year until an amphibious invasion of the home islands succeeded. Japanese occupation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia had produced mass famine. 2 million had already died in Vietnam alone. Some 300,000 civilians across the region were dying each month. There is no denying the fact that the American decision to end the war in the Far East quite brutally with the atomic bombs was taken to save the lives of Allied prisoners of war rather than those of indigenous populations. But it also happened to save many times more Japanese lives than all of those killed by the two explosions. The Japanese Imperial Army was determined to fight on to the end, resisting any invasion of the home islands, and was not overly influenced by the Soviet Union's attack on Mongolia and Manchuria, as General Umezu's remark shows. The strange obsession of the military leaders was not so much a fear of the Red Army in northern China and Manchuria, but a fear of communist revolution at home, a possibility of which there appears to be practically no evidence at all.